So what happens if you have excess cash? That's a high-class problem. So what we want to do is, if we have extra cash and we don't want to distribute it to shareholders, let's say, we may need it. So we're going to park it somewhere. We're going to invest it in safe and highly liquid investments because we don't know when we need it. And it would be a shame to need money, not have it there because it's tied up in a 6-month CD and you have to borrow money. That would be a real shame. So we need to pick among alternatives. The lowest risk are U.S. Treasuries, and these are low risk but very low interest rates. Next would be U.S. agency securities. These could be for the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, which are agencies of the federal government for mortgages. Third would be CDs. You can go to bank and get a maturity date of 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, or a year, and get slightly higher interest rate, perhaps, than you would see from the U.S. Treasury securities. Finally, you can buy commercial paper, which is issued by high-quality corporations, and they are not insured, but there's low risk due to the quality and reliability of payment from these issuers. Most companies have a treasury department, or at least a treasury function, and they manage the money. They manage the cash that we need. They invest the excess cash, and that's who would make these decisions. And most companies don't want to have idle funds lying around because it's not earning assets. So we're trying to deploy assets in a way that they earn us money. If we're running the business, we're making money. If we are having excess cash, don't leave it in a checking account that bears zero interest. Put it in some interest-bearing account at a risk level that you're comfortable undertaking. And when we look at cash needs, we'll look at some lumpy, if you will, requirements. Dividends. Dividends are paid typically every 3 months. So we want to make sure that come dividend day, we have enough cash. Bond or loan payments. We saw that bond payments are typically every 6 months. So we want to make sure that we don't get in default and miss a payment to our bondholders. Next are capital expenditures. As again, we saw in the cash budget example, there may be some projects that you've approved that will have large blocks of cash moving as we buy new equipment, buy land or buildings, things of that sort. And finally, there are seasonal cash needs. If you're in a ski business, you're going to have cash needs before the winter comes, so you could get your inventory ready. So when ski season hits, you're able to have inventory on hand to sell to your customers. So there could be seasonal cash needs as well. The Treasury Department will do cash forecasting to consider all these things to make sure that we don't run out of cash. Next is saying, well, let's say we knew that we have certain assets we want to have, and it's through some time period. So the left side shows the operating assets that fluctuate. There's a certain amount that is cyclical based on seasons. There's some that may be cyclical based on economic conditions, right? But regardless, we're likely to see some fluctuation in our assets required. On the other side, where does the money come from? And under this approach, which is called matching, things that are long-term and will be there for a long while, we'll use long-term financing, such as debt, that's long-term. We'll look at equity investments, which by definition are long-term, and we have some spontaneous liabilities that will grow as we grow. So these are fairly safe amounts to put into long-term financing. Now this part that's fluctuating, we can get short-term debt to cover this bumpy need based on seasonality or cyclicality. So short-term debt matches with short-term fluctuations. Long-term sources match more permanent levels of assets that we need to have. So the matching approach is that we have fixed assets and permanent levels of current assets that are all financed with long-term resources right here. Then we look at the permanent level of current assets. So even though they're current, we tend to have a certain amount of inventory. We tend to have a certain amount of receivables. So we're also going to devote long-term liabilities to fund those investments as well. And then the only change is this part that's wavy, so that we don't have times where we owe extra interest for things we don't need. We're just borrowing what we need, and therefore this is our debt. All right? So this is a matching moderate risk approach. The next scenario is relatively aggressive, where we have that same fluctuation in our asset requirement, but notice that instead of having long-term go all the way up here to cover all our permanent needs for operating assets, we actually go halfway, which means that we're allowing short-term debt to cover some of this area with the idea that we can refinance that on a recurring basis. So this is relatively aggressive, so that we do all the fixed assets with long-term liabilities and capital, and we take a portion of permanent level with long-term financing, and then we have short-term here. And that will then be more aggressive because we're betting on our ability to lower this amount, and we'll save a little bit more interest than if we somehow had more debt than we needed for the asset level that we currently have. The conservative approach has the same characteristics of what we need, but in this case, notice that the debt and the long-term capital covers everything we need up through the average, as drawn here, of the fluctuating short-term requirement. So we're going to be in some periods like here where we borrow and we need a little bit of extra to top off our needs. But then there are times here where we borrowed more money, and that's the dotted line. We borrowed more money than the liabilities and assets require. So we end up actually costing ourselves a little money there because we borrowed more money than we needed. And that's why in this case that the equity, long-term debt, and spontaneous liabilities cover all the fixed assets, permanent level of current assets, and the average of the fluctuating short-term assets. So therefore, it's more conservative, but we won't run out of money. Then we have just these tiny little peaks that we have to finance on a peak need basis. There's no right answer on how to finance. So we'll look at the level of volatility in our current assets and our liabilities, and that should guide us on how much risk we want to take in financing the assets that we need. If we look at the specific aspects other than the dollar amount, long-term debt has these characteristics. Once you negotiate it, you can concentrate on running a business for a long time. So that's an advantage of long-term debt. You don't have to constantly be arranging for financing. And as long as you're current with your loan obligations, the lender cannot force you to pay it earlier. So you're okay with this, and that long-term period will allow you to focus on other things for the duration of that loan. Short-term debt is generally the yield curve is rising. So the shorter the loan period, the lesser the interest. So this is a way to save a little money on interest expense in general because of the rising yield curve. Next is short-term loans are usually variable, so they'll be more volatile in interest expense than term debt, which may be fixed rates. Lenders can change their minds on short-term too. What if they lend to you now, and when it renews next year, they say, well, I'm not sure we want to renew. You'll be caught in a bad place because you were relying on the renewal of that loan. You'll find that short-term loans are easier to negotiate because it's a lesser commitment on the part of the bank, and therefore it's a smoother process and one that the bank will be glad to do because they are in the business of providing loans, and many of those are short-term credit facilities. And the other aspect is short-term debt might be easier to pay early because there's no interest penalty, such as a prepayment penalty that exists on many long-term loans. Commercial paper is marketable securities that large companies can distribute. So if you qualify, if you're a General Electric or an IBM, you can directly issue securities out of your company to someone that has the money, institutional investors, for example.